What a pleasure it is to welcome you all to this event. Let me first thank Andy Coopersmith from Wharton Public Policy Initiative, who is hosting us in this conversation with financial journalists. I'm Peter Conti-Brown. I'm an assistant professor here at Wharton, and I'm delighted to welcome you and our special guests. So let me start here by welcoming Ryan Tracy from the Wall Street Journal, Jeanna Smialek, thank you, from Bloomberg. I know Jeanna very well. We talk all the time, and I was afraid I was going to mispronounce her name. I'm glad I didn't. So Jeanna Smialek from Bloomberg, and Binyamin Appelbaum from the New York Times. So my first question, I'll start with Ryan and then to Jeanna and Binya, is could you tell us a little bit more about your biography and what led you from even before college or through college on to writing about finance and monetary policy and the other things that you do as journalists?
So about me, I went to Penn, actually, graduated in 2006. My hardest question on my early job interviews was, why didn't I write for the DP? Because I actually didn't. And I kind of got into journalism right after that. I was a history major here, and I just knew how to write. And so found an internship at the Trenton Times, which is a local paper outside where I grew up in New Jersey, and I was there for a few years. And I went to get a graduate degree, master's degree in journalism for a year, and that kind of helped me hear about a job opening at the Wall Street Journal / Dow Jones Newswire's bureau in DC, and moved there about 7 years ago. I was covering energy policy for a few years, and then about 4 years ago moved to financial regulation, which is what I cover now.
Great.
Hi guys, I'm Jeanna Smialek. I am a Fed and economy reporter at Bloomberg News. I was born and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I went to school in the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where I was absolutely convinced I was going to be a politics reporter, so they have a really good political reporting program. I did one internship for Hearst News covering politics. I became absolutely convinced that that is not what I wanted to do, not what I wanted to do with my life. So I ended up at Bloomberg interning, and I interned initially on the health team and absolutely loved it. So I had every intention of graduating college and going into health reporting, which is kind of a nice blend of policy and business. So it's a little closer to political reporting, which is what my training was. And I did one internship on the economy beat and just never left. They never got rid of me. So I've been doing it for 5 years and 3 years on the Fed. So kind of the Sparks and Notes version of my story.
As it happens, I'm also a Penn graduate and also a former history major. I graduated in 2001. I did have the good sense to work for the DP, however. And fell in love with journalism, and after Penn, went to work for some newspapers, first in Jacksonville, Florida, and then in Charlotte, North Carolina, covering a wide range of subjects. And it was in Charlotte, which was still is a big banking center. The managing editor called me up one day and said, "We're looking for a banking reporter." And I said, "That sounds horribly boring." And he said, "You are the new banking reporter." That is quite literally how I became a financial journalist. It turned out not to be boring at all, because that was, right on the cusp of a historic crisis, and it's been fascinating. And I wrote about banking and banking regulation for a while, and then started covering economic policy, monetary policy, and subjects like that. But that's the nutshell version.
Great. So I've got specific questions for each of our panelists based on some of their stories, some of their favorite, or some of my favorite of their stories. So let me start with you, Ryan. So Ryan, you wrote, I think about a year and a half ago, a piece called Stress Test, Inc. For those of you who don't know, one of the key innovations of Dodd-Frank, which was the legislative response to the 2008 crisis, was to institutionalize this thing called stress tests. You might know them from any engineering course you've taken. And now we're stress testing banks. So we're asking the banks to turn over data about their balance sheets to the government to test them, to see how they would perform in the event of crisis, right? So your piece, stress testing, does a lot of different things, but it's basically talking about the big business that stress tests have become for all kinds of folks. Big pieces of legislation like this are often called lawyers' full employment acts, right? So lawyers get an awful lot of work out of Dodd-Frank. Your piece highlighted the work of others, consultants, specialized compliance officers within the banks, a nice tantalizing little tidbit about hiring creative writing MFAs to script the narrative of these stress test submissions. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about even that piece or other pieces, like what's the process of turning these ideas into a story, and then in this context for stress tests or in financial journalism more broadly, what's the power of narrative? Why does it end up mattering so much, or is it just a gimmick to get people to pay attention because they lack the sophistication to pay attention to the more quantifiable stuff?
Yeah, that's a challenge I think we struggle with a lot, is how do we get people interested in this stuff, particularly on the regulatory side of things. It can be really, really esoteric, and stress tests have an entire vocabulary of acronyms and really confusing jargon associated with them. So that story idea came from wanting to write a story to draw attention to the fact that the test results were going to come out. This was like June of last year. And the idea was, how do I write about this in a way that is interesting to people, And so I think, that I guess I would admit that like part of financial journalism is tricking people into reading about stuff that they might think on its face is kind of boring, or, isn't something they would necessarily click on. And so you've got to find the narrative to do that, right? So if you just saw a story with a bunch of numbers in it about what happened in the stock market yesterday, that might not be particularly interesting to my mom, or even, maybe your average Wall Street Journal subscriber would want to know what the market did, but they might not spend that much time on that article unless you kind of tell them a story about what happened in the market yesterday and why it mattered. So that's a big part of our job, is finding the narratives, and I guess that biases us towards conflict a little bit, and there's other things you could say about that, but yeah.
Great. So Jeanna, you can build on some of these same ideas if you'd like, but I have something specific about some of a big part of your beat, and that has to do with the financial reserve, or the Federal Reserve System. Jeanna, with colleagues at Bloomberg, is really specialized in lifting up the hood of the Fed's governance. Who are these people who sit in these seats of power, pulling these levers of power? In particular, the 12 Federal Reserve banks that are scattered unevenly throughout the country each have a president. And Jeanna has done a lot of great reporting on these presidential searches as they occur. So Jeanna, you don't have to convince me that this is important, but I also write about this stuff. How do you convince other people to pay attention to this kind of politicking when you're facing the challenge that the process is wrapped in opacity, and you have to simultaneously report and educate?
Great. Yeah, so it's a really interesting question. And I think just by way of context, this is one of the more interesting moments in history to really watch these regional Fed presidents, because up until really the Ben Bernanke's time at the Fed was all about sort of being this totally closed off institution that didn't let people see what was happening inside of it. Greenspan famously said that he tried his best to mumble with great incoherence, and if people understood what he was saying, something had gone awfully wrong. And so really only since the financial crisis have we seen this big opening up at the Fed. So you're reporting on this institution that is at this sort of complete crossroads when it comes to transparency, and it's really working hard on becoming more accountable to the public. At the same time, there's some internal resistance to change. And so it's this really interesting tension within the institution that we're covering. And so we're trying to get that out. A lot of these president searches are open in ways that previous ones haven't been, so we're really sort of treading new water in totally new territory when we're covering them. And so one of the things that Chris Condon, my colleague who covers this closely with me, and I try and do, is really make our stories sort of explainer style. So for example, this past week, we got a new New York Fed president. It's a really big deal. New York Fed president votes every time. They tend to form this sort of policy troika with the vice chair and the chair in Washington. And so they're really, really a powerful job. And so we were kind of trying to explain this process, explain why it was important. And we would do things like, here are 5 things you need to know about the new New York Fed president, or, sort of a more BuzzFeed almost approach. So something was a little bit more digestible. And I think it's a good way to come at a really wonky topic that is kind of hard to wrap your head around and maybe a little bit harder for a lay audience to get interested in, but is also simultaneously extremely important, is to sort of put it in a familiar format like that. And then a lot of what we've done is try and go multimedia. So we do like explainer videos, we do a lot of enhancements like that, graphic enhancements. And so we'll have landing pages on these folks. And so anyone who's a regular Bloomberg reader will kind of know that those landing pages exist, and it's an easy way to get smart on a person pretty quickly.
Binya, you've been on the finance beat probably longer than your other co-panelists, and there's so many different articles to choose from in different areas. But you cover really all aspects of financial and economic policy journalism, and not just the Fed. And one of the pieces of yours that I wanted to highlight and mention was a profile you did in the New York Times of Anat Admati. Raise your hand if you've heard of Anat Admati. One person. So she's a mentor of mine and a co-author and a very dear friend, and is one of the most influential academics in the banking policy space. Influential in part because she annoys the hell out of bankers so completely in something that's extraordinarily technical, which is in the way that banks structure their balance sheets and the way that the government regulates how much of those balance sheets can be constituted by equity versus debt financing. But in this profile, what was the title of the profile? When she talks bankers...
I don't remember exactly.
Something like that. But it was just basically going to this idea of how hated she was among bankers, but how influential she had been in shaping the debate, at least in their reaction to it. So I'd love to hear more about that article, but in particular, if you could use it as a vehicle to discuss how much personality matters in this space. Certainly in these walls, we talk a lot about finance as a function of asset prices and formulas and quantifiable data. But would you agree that personality matters in ways that are distinct from what can be quantified? And if so, how do you, as a journalist, think about the role of personalities? How do you report on personalities, and how does that shape your thinking?
So I think that it's clear that people's personalities play a huge role in shaping financial policy and shaping financial markets. I was actually recently talking to Alan Greenspan, who is probably as pure a believer in the idea of the rational market as anyone ever placed on Earth. And one of the things he said to me was that the one thing he's changed his mind about in all his long years on this planet is that behavioral factors are more important than he used to think. That people matter, that the way that we make decisions matters. So Anat Admati's contribution to this, as Peter said, she's a gadfly. She's a finance professor at Stanford, and she didn't really study the financial industry for many years. She was more focused on the finance structure of non-financial companies. And at the time of the financial crisis, she took an interest in it in the way that many of us did, because that was the part of the economy that was breaking down. And what struck her when she started looking at these companies was how heavily dependent they were on debt financing. Banks borrow a much larger share of their funding than essentially any other industry. And she couldn't understand why they were allowed to do that, why markets permitted banks to be that leveraged. And she became fascinated by that question and the related question of why the government allowed banks to be that leveraged. And it consumed her, as any issue that she is interested in tends to consume her. She's an extraordinarily energetic, focused, peripatetic person. Once she gets a hold of you, she doesn't stop talking until you insist that she has to, and sometimes not even then. So she's a fascinating person. And she became consumed by this and decided that she needed to explain to the world that banks ought to be forced to derive more of their funding from equity, and that would effectively solve the issue that we were all struggling with, which is how do we make the financial industry safer? To the extent that a bank is funded by equity, it can lose that money without endangering its viability as an institution. That's the deal when you put equity into a company. You're hoping it's going to do well. If it doesn't, tough luck. And she thought that if we would just raise by an order of magnitude the share of bank funding that came from equity, you'd ask her, what's the number? And she'd say, I don't know what the number is, but we're in the wrong ballpark right now. We were down in the single digits, and she wanted to get up into the 30s or the 40s. She wanted to be in a different place. And And she started waging this campaign to convince anyone she could get her hands on, policymakers, journalists, elected officials, that this was necessary. And one of the things she did, I told people there's a sort of a backstory here that's interesting about financial journalism. One of the things she did is she came to Washington to meet with journalists. And I happened to be in the session that was arranged for her. And I arrived with the understanding of bank capital that I had been taught by the banking industry. If you listen to bankers talk about capital, they incessantly describe it as something that is held. They convey very clearly the idea that capital is segregated and placed somewhere and that it's essentially a weight on their balance sheets and that it's money they can't do anything with, and why are they being forced to hold it? It's a terrible burden. And I brought this understanding with me and kept pressing her on why she was describing, this funding source as a viable alternative to debt when bankers reliably told you that it was, a huge way that it was more expensive to raise capital than to raise debt, that it was, a weight on profitability. And she got increasingly frustrated with me, and we ended up basically yelling at each other. We left, and I didn't really think anything more of it, except that, I meet a lot of crazy academics, and, they often have very fixed ideas about the world that they're trying to communicate, and you let it go, and I didn't understand what she was saying. And the following year, she wrote a book called, I think, The Banker's New Clothes, in which she tried to make her case as clearly as possible. It's an excellent book, really lucid, expository, really accessible to a broad audience. It made a big splash, really made her name on this issue. And I read it and finally understood what she had been trying to say. And I ran into her not that long thereafter and told her that. And she said, "Oh, that's good. I wrote that book because of you. I was so frustrated that the New York Times couldn't understand this issue that I said, what can I do?" So she wrote a book about it. So that was, for me, it's kind of a mortifying experience because, you're supposed to understand these things. My job is to explain things to people. But the truth is that, there's a lot of things you don't understand. You're constantly grappling with. You're trying to improve your understanding. And so the story that Peter is describing is a story I wrote basically because I felt like, okay, I finally get this, and I want to make sure that everyone else does too, to the extent that I can. And so I wrote, as clearly and colorfully about her. And as Ryan was saying earlier, you inject conflict into it. So I set it up as a story of her warring against these institutions, which was without doubt true. But that's where that story came from.
That's great. So let me tee up another question for each of you. So we live in an era where fake news is bandied about. So a set of questions. Number one, how has your reporting and the reporting environment changed in the last 2 to 3 years? And number two, I think this kind of gets to the epistemology of your work, and in some ways the work that I do as well as an academic. I don't mean to sound like Pontius Pilate when I ask this question, but what is truth, right? How do you be objective?
Yeah, these last couple of years have been really strange and disorienting and difficult in a lot of ways. The rules that we all sort of understood ourselves to operate under turned out to be norms and unenforceable norms at that. And so, we found ourselves in this very strange position of writing about people who are entirely indifferent to the truth, who will lie and insist that the lie is correct, who will present documents that don't even add up on their own terms. The federal budget last year literally didn't add up. The document itself was inconsistent. And you would present it to officials at the budget office and say, you didn't do the math right. You literally failed addition here. This isn't, you can't call this a plan because, your numbers don't work. And, they just kept going. And I've been doing this a little while now, and I've never been in that situation of, being able to say to someone, here's a verifiable lie, and have them ignore that and be indifferent to that. I would write stories. If during the Obama administration, if I wrote a story, it was, that whatever was in my story that was in any way negative about the Obama administration, it was reliably the case. The Times at that time would put stories online, between 10 and 11 p.m. And my phone would ring. It was absolutely certain. There was a White House staffer whose job it was to call at me and yell at me as soon as the story went online. Whatever it was I'd written, it was wrong, it was unfair, couldn't I change it? That was that person's job. It can't have been a very good job, but there you go. And because they cared. They really cared deeply about the presentation of facts in the New York Times. And with the Trump administration, by contrast, I can write that they are liars, which I have done on several occasions. I can write that they can't do math. I can write that, their policy will do the opposite of what they say it's going to do. And it doesn't matter. That makes you question what you're doing. It makes you question whether you could be doing it in a different way or should be doing it in a different way. And I think journalism has become more forceful as a consequence. You asked, do we feel comfortable saying that something is bull or is not true? There's a lot more of that than there used to be. There's a lot more comfort with that, of necessity, I think. So it's really been a very different period as a journalist. And I think we're still struggling with the question of how to deal with these realities. And I'm not sure we've found the right answers yet.
So Binya, do you have biases, as any human does?
Yeah, of course I do.
What do you
Objectivity
do
is a goal. It's not a reality. My goal as a journalist is to write as clearly and as fairly as I can. I think that part of fairness is pointing out when I understand something to be untrue, or when I think that the consequences of a given policy are reasonably clear, to say that. And to say, that something is a majority view, or something is reasonably certain, or that something has been proven repeatedly to be the case. We've had experiments, for example, with supply-side tax cuts. This is not a de novo experiment. We can talk about the historical record of what happens when you reduce income tax rates. We don't need to treat it as some sort of, mysterious question which will only be resolved in the future. But at the same time, you want to be, make sure that you are presenting the sides in the debate. I mean, one of the difficulties is, if you have a position that is shared by a significant portion of the electorate, in defiance of, say, scientific evidence, what do you do about that? That's a really hard question,
Sort of picking up on that point, and I'm going to say something that's kind of an unpopular opinion, which also sort of follows on all the things Binya just said. So agreeing that this is sort of a very difficult time to be a journalist, and it's certainly a challenging one to present the truth. I do think there's a good thing that's come out of sort of the dawn of this fake news era, and I think that is that we're all being a lot more introspective about what actually is truth. So I think there were things that we just took for granted as truth before, that in the wake of the election you really can't, because I think you see that there's this huge portion of the population that doesn't believe the thing that you write as fact all the time. And it makes you really ask, is that true? And if the answer to that question is, yeah, it is true, then I think it makes you ask, why doesn't it feel true to these people? Like, what about this doesn't resonate? And I report on labor markets, so I think that I get a really good view on that, because labor markets are something that's so sort of innately, human at its very core. People's experience with the job market and whether we are in a good economy that they can feel is something that, you have numbers, you have all this data that should tell you in aggregate how things feel. But if you're hearing over and over again, you're wrong, we're not at full employment, you're wrong when you say that the unemployment rate looks good, I think it really makes you question your premises. And so I think if there's been a positive thing out of the whole fake news era, I think that is it. That I think not just Bloomberg, but I think all journalists, and not just business journalists, but I think political journalists as well, are really questioning a lot of their premises.
I don't think any of us figured out what we're supposed to do in a world where the President of the United States calls your profession like disgusting and dishonest as often as he does. I don't know what to do with that. It's kind of incredible to me. And I have one story where I was actually there live listening to him say that. I was on Sunday duty, which we do twice a year in my bureau. And so you just kind of cover whatever's going on that day. And there happened to be the Rolling Thunder rally in DC, which is essentially thousands of people riding, they don't call them motorcycles, what do they call them? Hogs, yeah, down the mall and around, and then to a rally in front of the Lincoln Memorial. And at that time, like, even the idea of Donald Trump speaking in front of the Lincoln Memorial as a presidential candidate was still like hard to wrap your head around. And so I'm in this literally crowd full of bikers and holding a notebook and a pen, and he just talks about disgusting media, you know, people start looking at me through the corner of their eye, and I'm just like, okay, you know, backing up to the back of the crowd. I mean, nothing happened, but, you know, I don't know what to do with that. The best answer I've come up with is just to try to do our jobs the best we can, and to me that means, you know, you put the facts out there and let the chips fall where they may, basically. And I think we can also do a better job of showing our work a little bit, you know, like, we do operate by a set of principles and by standards, even though they're not in law or formalized. You know, at all the places where we work, if we write something that's factually inaccurate and you point that out, we will correct the story and explain exactly why we did that. And we, you know, fact check things with multiple sources, and we do all these things that I just wonder sometimes whether there's an appreciation of the standards that we have. And so maybe if there isn't, we can do a better job of explaining how we arrived at the story that we've written, you know?
When I first approached Andy Coopersmith about doing this event, I approached him first, and I thought, I want to invite my 3 favorite financial journalists, and bang, 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 all 3 said yes right away, and here they are. I think you'll agree with me that they did such a fantastic job. Please join me in thanking them.